Hello, everyone. My name is Brian McNulty. I am an LPC, licensed professional counselor. I'm also the current clinical director at the Woodlake Bogalusa facility. And today I'm going to be doing education on understanding the biology of addiction. So sit back and enjoy, and we'll see if I can get people to think differently about what addiction is. All right. So getting started. The first question I think that's important is, what is addiction? Now, many people have different answers, and one of the reasons is it really depends on who you ask. So if you ask someone, say you're sitting at a bar and you're drinking with your buddy and turn to him and you say, hey man, you think I have a drinking problem? He's probably going to say no. And so very different answer than if you asked, your mother-in-law or somebody like that. They might have a completely different answer. It also depends on your frame of reference, right? Because down here in South Louisiana, we drink differently than people say in, Provo, Utah. So once again, very different. So let's try to find out, and that's really the goal here. I'll tell you, most people that I first meet, they come in, they have an understanding of what they think addiction is because, well, it has to make sense to them. And, you know, uh, with substance use, it's really easy to just go with the belief that it is a substance caused problem and the substance is the problem. But we're going to, like I said, we're going to talk more about this. So, um, about 1988, the Human Genome Project started, which was basically how, mapping out how the brain works, brain activity. Um, a lot of research was done with trying to understand addiction because it didn't make a whole lot of sense. I mean, for a long time we've described addiction as an illness, but we couldn't really point to what was broken or what was defective. And so it was kind of a soft diagnosis, like, yeah, it's an illness, but it's an illness that is substance caused. I don't know. So, like I said, a lot of formal research and even less formal research. Here's a guy, I think, on Canal Street, New Orleans, that he was trying to get more research funding, and all he was able to do was to confirm his diagnosis of being an alcoholic. But anyway, um, the uh, what do we know really? Well, what we know is the use of drugs and alcohol and the illness called addiction seem to be related, right? Um, uh, you know, but is the addictive behavior of using, drinking, is that the same as the illness? Is drinking and using drugs, is that addiction? And does that use cause the brain to change? Now, this has been a big debate for a long time that the belief was some people had were vulnerable to a genetic predisposition of addiction. That's what it was always told to me. Um, and that if you drank and you had this, there's a good chance you you would start using addictively. Um, and with that, there are a lot of people that will say, well, I can drink and stop. Why can't you? Because it seems something's happened. Whether it's you drank too much or too often, or you had this predisposition. Um, but if you could only stop when I would stop, then you'd be okay. Now, the other thing that we can question here: does the brain illness called addiction lead to the person finding or using substances or engaging in certain behaviors to treat the symptoms of that brain illness. That's very different. So what we're talking about here is one is substance use changes the brain. The other is the brain was already dysfunctional and the use of substances gave it relief from their symptoms. So, all right. Yeah, so this is one of my sons had a project due in sixth grade where it was a PowerPoint, and I really got into it, and I apologize for the sounds and all the screen changes. So the current worldview implies that illness is a choice and obviously behavioral. I'm not saying that everyone is saying this. What I'm saying is the way it's treated, the way people that have it are treated, is that you made some bad choices, now you got to live with your consequences. And this is coming from people who will say, well, but addiction is an illness, but it's an illness that you, I don't know, chose to get. It really, they give a lot of lip service to it being an illness, yet they still treat it and treatment and treat the person as if you just had made better choices in your life, if you were more able to behave appropriately, you wouldn't have this problem. All right. Also, that apparently it's caused and maintained by substance use alone. So what they mean by this, and these aren't blatantly spoken or written even, but the way it's treated, the way people are treated. If you get some abstinence, then you'll be okay, or at least the goal is to get you to stop using. That's all. And if we can get you to stop using, then you can't maintain it, right? And that the longer you go without it, the better off you'll be. And a kind of a belief that the people who have the illness were without symptoms before they ever used. So they were just perfect, normal people walking along. They started using substances. It triggered their predisposition for addiction or damaged their brain. And now they have this. And if we could get them to stop, they should have minor symptoms at best. And the question is why? Why would somebody no longer have symptoms once they stop? Well, there are people that stop and are able to abstain from drinking or using and don't really go to meetings or have to do any recovery. And those are few and far between, and I would say they would have a mild version of what addiction is, or maybe they don't have addiction at all. But the vast majority of people will continue to have symptoms after they stop. And also, this worldview implies that it cannot be caused by anything other than certain substances. So now there's, the idea that as long as you stay away from certain drugs or alcohol, that you shouldn't end up with addiction. And once you view it as a substance problem, it's very limited in what you can do with it or do for it. So let's take a look at the American Society of Addiction Medicine, otherwise known as ASAM. They came out with a groundbreaking definition in 2011, and it really was based upon all the research that I talked about at the Human Genome Project. because after that, the 90s into to 2005, 2008, all these massive brain studies were done, and they learned a lot about where addiction takes place, what mechanisms are involved, um, what parts of the brain light up, and so they learned a lot about it. And but unfortunately, the the DSM, the Diagnostic and Statistical Manual for Mental Disorders, came out. The third edition came out in 1982, 83, and it stated its assumption was people had a normal brain, substances cause the brain to change, and that's what addiction is. And so that has been the definition from that assumption that normal brain, substance problem, right? That started in the 80s, before the Human Genome Project, before so it's pre-scientific. The DSM-5 now is out, and it is based on the same premise that it is a substance-caused problem. Now, ASAM, with all the data and research at its disposal, came up with this definition. And basically it says addiction is a primary chronic disease of brain reward, motivation, memory, and related circuitry. Dysfunction in these circuits leads to characteristic biological, psychological, social, and spiritual manifestations. This is reflected in the individual pursuing reward and or relief by substance use and other behaviors. So what does that mean? So basically it says it's a primary illness. Doesn't need to be caused by anything else. It is an illness in and of itself. It's a chronic illness that means it isn't going to ever go away. And it is a problem of the brain. Reward, motivation, memory. That is the reward center of the brain, otherwise known as the nucleus accumbens and the ventral tegmental area. For those of you that are counting. And dysfunction in that part of the brain leads the person to have symptoms, discomfort, biological, psychological, social, and spiritual discomfort or negative symptoms. And the individual will pursue reward and or relief by substance use. So in other words, they have the symptoms and they're engaging in behavior or substance use to get relief from those symptoms. So what this is saying is the illness was already there and the substance was used to treat it. Now, that is really important. So the resulting strategy of it being a substance problem rather than a brain disorder was, you know what we can do? If we could prevent the person from ever using a drug, we can prevent addiction. That makes perfect sense if it's the drug that's causing the problem. So you know what we'll do? We'll declare a war on drugs, and we'll interdict and keep all these substances out. And if we do that, then people will just never use this stuff, and they'll just be happy, joyous, and free. And how's that going, by the way? Anybody have any results of that war? Yeah, well, getting our ass kicked. Anyway, that we can prevent you using drugs through legal and economic consequences rather than medical treatment. What they're saying is, you know, if your consequences are high enough, you're a rational being, and you will use your cortex, your rational mind, to make a decision to no longer use, because you don't want to go to jail, and you don't want to have to pay all this money, and so basically they're saying it's a behavior and a choice, and if you had the right motivations, you could change your behavior, you could modify your behavior, and you could make a different choice. And once again, how is that working? Go talk to the people at drug court. And we can prevent the worsening of the illness by stopping the drug use, because it's caused by substances. That means if we can get you to stop using, it won't continue to worsen. Now we have a bunch of anecdotal evidence of people saying that they were sober for 10 years, and when they relapsed, it was as if their drinking or using had progressed even while they weren't drinking or using. And I'll explain that later in understanding the progressive nature of the illness. All right. And medical treatment, this is actually, I don't know, for me it's interesting anyway, that we can prevent the reward from using, thereby preventing drug use and addiction. What they're saying is, if we could keep someone from experiencing the high, or whatever it is that they're looking for from that substance, and they didn't get that from that substance, that they would just stop trying. So they actually achieved this. Very, very interesting. They came up with a kind of inoculation. So they had a study of males with cocaine dependence, what it was called, cocaine addiction, cocaine use disorder, whatever the hell it is now. So all these males that had pretty severe cocaine problems on an outpatient basis, they injected this, basically it was a bunch of antibodies that would stay in the system for up to 6 months. And what happens, these antibodies would, if somebody used cocaine, it would go into the bloodstream. When it goes into the bloodstream, these antibodies would attach to the cocaine molecule. And they would attach, and the cocaine molecule would become too large to pass through the blood-brain barrier. So it couldn't get to the brain. And so it prevented the cocaine from activating at the brain and spiking the hell out of dopamine and them having all their, the high they were looking for. Ingenious, and obviously it cost a pretty penny. And it worked. Cocaine use among that population dropped to almost nothing. I mean, a few still tried to see if they could get through it, but it didn't work. And so, success, right? Well, not really, because while they didn't test positive for cocaine anymore, they tested positive for methamphetamine, for opioids, for cannabis, for alcohol, for anything and everything else. Because you take away one of them, the main substance that they were looking to get relief from the symptoms, you take that away, and they just move down the list. What else is there? So, so even if you were able to come up with a vaccine of sorts that had antibodies for all the drugs of abuse, right? I don't know if you'd have enough room for any of the blood, but let's say you did. And so no matter what they tried, whether it was heroin, cannabis, meth, opioids, anything, that there was an answer for it, then what would you have? You would have somebody that is still trying to find relief from the symptoms that are driving them to use a substance anyway. And they may engage certain behaviors, sex, gambling, eating, exercise, any number of things. But the goal is, I don't like the way I feel. I don't want to feel this way. I need something to make me feel better. If that's the real problem, then identifying the substance as the problem shows why we haven't been successful. Because let me say this: if the substance is the problem, then abstinence is the solution, right? But if the brain is the problem, so I have a problem in my brain, I don't have enough dopamine or whatever, and when I use substances, I feel better. So I have these symptoms. Because of these symptoms, I use a substance. Well, now, the substance isn't the problem. The substance is actually a solution to the symptoms. So in essence, when we try to treat, if it is a brain issue, and we're trying to treat the substance, We're trying to treat the symptom of a symptom. The real symptom is the irritability, frustration, and so what that causes is, I mean, how many illnesses can you have where you treat the symptom of a symptom and you find that you're successful? All right, moving forward. Now, if it's a biological cause, right, instead of a substance, what it means is, what would it mean if there was a real biological illness that caused addiction? Well, it would mean that it wouldn't be limited to drugs and alcohol, right? That in essence, the brain is where the problem is. And addiction would not be secondary to drugs. Like, I use drugs, I have addiction. It would be primary. And they would have certain symptoms of that illness that would predate the use of drugs. And that even if you got treatment and became abstinent, you would still have certain symptoms unless you treated the brain disorder. Once again, if you treat the symptom of a symptom, and the substance is a symptom that is being used to treat the real symptom of addiction, which might be, irritability, frustration, lack of focus, motivation issues, not feeling connected to others, not feeling comfortable around others, right? And if it were a biological cause, it would respond to medication and recovery. There is, if you understand where it takes place, there are medications that might be able to help treat that. So that would make a big difference. So here's a typical kind of drawing of what the midbrain reward center, where addiction takes place, the reward center of the brain. You have the VTA, which is ventral tegmental area. You don't need to know that, but I just say that so I feel smart. And then you have the NA, the nucleus accumbens. This is where the magic happens. The ventral tegmental area sends dopamine molecules over to the nucleus accumbens, which has dopamine receptors, right? And when you have normal dopamine production and enough receptors available, you end up with good dopamine tone. And dopamine tone is just kind of your average level of dopamine, which means you have good focus and attention, tend to be motivated, you connect easily to other people, you are able to enjoy things, and you get normal reward out of life. So that's what people who have a normal reward center have. In other words, if you don't have a normal reward center, all these under dopamine, all these you're gonna have issues with. Now, when you have good solid dopamine tone like that, the nucleus accumbens sends a little message to the cortex, your rational brain, via the serotonin system, and says things are fine. So what do you think happens when the nucleus accumbens doesn't have good dopamine levels? The message it sends is going to be things are not fine, right? And you may tend to present as anxious or even depressed if it goes on too long. And you may get treatment. We need to get those serotonin levels up. And it's really, the problem isn't really the serotonin system. It is the dopamine system. So, all right. So what is addiction? Once again, it's a problem in the midbrain part of the brain, the midbrain circuit. And basically it is, the problem is low dopamine tone. What does that mean? It means there's not enough dopamine produced. Yeah. Where I used to work, we did genetic testing on patients, and we found that in the majority of cases, there was a dopamine production problem, where they they didn't produce enough of an enzyme at the MTHFR receptor. You have a certain enzyme that is produced that helps metabolize folic acid. So if you don't have enough of this enzyme, you don't metabolize enough of folic acid. Why is that important? Folic acid metabolizes into a substance called L-methylfolate, which is a building block ingredient of dopamine and serotonin, by the way. So if you don't make enough of that enzyme, you don't metabolize it enough, and let's say, you're metabolizing at 80% when you're, genetically when you're born. Every decade after the brain is matured, you lose 7 to 10% of dopamine production naturally. So if you're lower than that, you're going to experience low dopamine tone from the day you're able to remember what you're doing. And so that's a big issue. So if you don't produce enough dopamine, you're already starting with low dopamine tone. You don't have enough dopamine receptors available. Why is that important? Dopamine receptors are so the dopamine molecules will attach to the receptors, and that's where the magic happens. That's where it sends the message. So if you don't, let's say you have enough dopamine molecules, but you don't have enough receptors, or you don't have enough receptors available, then once again, you're going to have low dopamine. So why do people not have enough receptors? Well, dopamine receptor density, or the amount that are available, when you feel alone, less than, full of shame, guilt, or remorse, those receptors withdraw. If you've experienced trauma in your life, they can withdraw and stay withdrawn. And so we don't have medication to help with dopamine receptor density. But one of the interesting things is what happens when people go to AA or 12-step meetings is they feel known, understood, cared about. No one's better than them. And if they can hear the message, what will end up happening is they'll feel a part of and connect a little bit, and that increases dopamine receptor availability. Now that's important, and it's also one of the reasons why AA and NA and all those A programs, anonymous programs, are still around. That does something. There's a neurobiology of addiction. There's a neurobiology of recovery, and so if I have dopamine production issues and dopamine receptor issues, my dopamine levels are going to be in the basement. If I can improve dopamine production and have decent receptor availability, all of a sudden I'm experiencing life from a different perspective. Some might say it may feel like a personality alteration, psychic upheaval, or even a spiritual awakening, where I view myself, others, in the world in a different light. Now there's a third component here, and that is how much time out in the synapse the dopamine molecules are. So in this system, dopamine is produced, receptors are available, and then there's a reuptake valve that sucks up all the excess dopamine to recycle it. If that reuptake valve works too fast, it sucks up the excess dopamine before it can get to the receptors. So there is a medication that can restrict the reuptake of dopamine called Wellbutrin. If that's where the problem is, that's what can be done. And if you can restrict the reuptake of dopamine, what will happen is you will slow the rate at which it gets sucked up, which allows more dopamine to reach the receptors. So if you have a problem in any of those areas that's significant enough, you're going to experience what are called low dopamine symptoms, right? So for those of you that want a simple formula to remember, this isn't even funny. Basically what it's saying is dopamine tone is how many molecules times how many receptors basically, and how long it stays out there. So don't worry about this. With low dopamine tone, the world is experienced from a deficit perspective. It's like walking through life dragging a tree branch behind you. Nothing is easy, everything's a pain in the ass. Now, I may do well for a while when I leave treatment, but my natural state is down here. And when I get down here, it's really unpleasant. Um, Now, I may engage in compulsive behaviors, to try to uh, spike or increase dopamine levels, um, and to but my natural state is my natural state. And so if I can't do anything to improve dopamine production, or how many receptors are available, or how long it stays in the synapse, my natural state is down here. If all I do is abstain, once again, if all I do is abstain, I don't improve dopamine levels. I just learn to live with it down here. I learned to live how to drag a tree branch. Oh, bye. So what I like to tell people, I use the Wizard of Oz. Everybody seen the Wizard of Oz movie? It starts off, in case you haven't, the Wizard of Oz movie starts off in black and white, and it's a farm in Kansas, right? Dorothy's on a farm in Kansas, and that's all she's ever known, and that's as good as it gets. And that's like somebody who was born with a genetic predisposition, whatever, born with low dopamine, has a problem with dopamine production, receptor density, and whatever. But they don't have enough dopamine, so they're not in a natural state, but they don't know they're not in a natural state because that's the only person they've ever known themselves as. Now, they may find themselves socially awkward, they might, engage in certain behaviors to try to improve dopamine, exercise, sports, music, video games. But typically what they do is they find something that makes them feel good and they do the shit out of it. They just do the ever-loving crap out of it. And they form a dopamine attachment to it. But let's just say low dopamine is kind of like living on a dusty farm in Kansas in black and white. Nothing stands out, but if that's all you've ever experienced, that's as good as it gets. Now, one day, you get introduced to a substance, alcohol, cocaine, cannabis, whatever. And, it spikes the hell out of dopamine. So that's kind of like being in Kansas and opening the door on Oz. And what do you see? Vibrant colors. I mean, just dazzling colors. Colors you've never seen before because you've been in black and white. They got little munchkins singing with big old lollipops. They got flying monkeys and wicked witches and all this crazy stuff. And that's what it's like to get that dopamine spike. Like, holy crap, I've been missing out a lot. Now, let's get you to abstain, though. I want you to abstain. So what we're trying to do is say, look, this shouldn't be too hard. We just got to nail close this door on Oz, and you go back to dusty-ass Kansas in black and white and see how long you can live there after seeing Oz. Really very difficult to think that, because in the back of your mind, it's like flying monkeys, right? So understanding that, it is very difficult to expect someone to go back to that uncomfortable place and stay there. If that's all you get out of recovery, you are missing the boat. Anyway, low dopamine symptoms. These are what you experience. Difficulty focusing, paying attention. And it may be because none of this stuff around me gives me any dopamine. Now, if I know that guy's Holden, I'm going to remember his name. That guy over there that introduced me to his friends, I don't remember any of those people's names. Unless there's something for that part of my brain where addiction takes place, I'm not remembering anything. So I don't really pay attention, focused stuff. I have difficulty remembering things, not because I have a bad memory. It's just because nothing stands out. It's like I said, everything's a bunch of gray, black, gray, and white. Nothing's really standing out. There's nothing blazing red except for, that the guy that told it. Easily frustrated with self. Easily self-frustrated. So not comfortable at all. Easily irritated with others. I'm frustrated with me. I'm uncomfortable with you. Procrastination, putting things off. Motivation issues. Not able to enjoy things as much as others. And it's almost like you're watching other people have fun, but you're not feeling it, you know, um, and trouble feeling connected or making connections to others. Um, it's only a few people, and so there's something missing. Now, with normal dopamine levels, people have no trouble with these things. With not enough dopamine, these are real issues. So when you use a substance and you're more focused and your memory's improved and you're less frustrated with self and less irritated by others and you're taking action, you're not procrastinating, and man, I'm enjoying things more and I can connect to others easily. I'm socially, I'm not as socially awkward. I'm improved. So when you use a substance and these symptoms are improved or treated, I'm going to do the hell out of that, right? So when I have any of these, let's say I'm abstinent and I start having these symptoms again, how long am I going to go? And I know what fixes it. How long am I going to go before I decide to treat this stuff? So that's why if you're viewing this as a substance problem rather than a brain issue and you keep struggling, this is going to be the reason why. I've identified the wrong problem. And if I've identified the wrong problem, I have a solution to the wrong problem. And that solution will not work for the real problem. In fact, as we can see here, it really sets you up to fail, right? So here's an inaccurate drawing, but which is easier to kind of explain, you know, how the midbrain works. This is not drawn to scale or even accurate, and a very simplified version because we don't need complicated here. So where you see the VTA and those green circles, that's dopamine packets, right? So when those are full for a normal person, you know, the dopamine molecules are released and they fall down. And the NA, nucleus accumbens, has all the receptors on them. And when enough molecules get to enough receptors, on a regular basis, it sends a message via serotonin to the cortex saying that you're okay. So those little green packets, if they're not full because you don't metabolize folic acid well, then you're releasing less in each packet. Not as many molecules are coming out. And as they float, they can be vacuumed up by the reuptake valve and then recycled through. If you don't have enough receptors available, once again, there's a problem there. So the good news is with dopamine production, for those people who can identify with a problem at the MTHFR, in other words, they don't metabolize folic acid well, they don't make enough L-methylfolate. Well, the good news is L-methylfolate comes in a capsule form. It's not classified as a medication, it's classified as a medical food. And for a while, you can only get it by prescription. I think now you can get it over the internet from pretty reliable quality sources. So if that's where the problem is, you could actually get prescribed or get L-methylfolate to help more normalize dopamine production. Amazing, right? Actually treating addiction where it is instead of where it isn't. It isn't in Colombia. It isn't at the border. Um, it isn't at the bar. It's in the brain. And if we treat it where it is, um, then we get relief from those low dopamine symptoms. If we get relief from those low dopamine symptoms, there is no need to use a substance to spike dopamine to feel better. Hmm. All right. So, what causes addiction then? Most of the people, it's genetics. They will get decreased reward in life and other low dopamine symptoms, leading to substance use to relieve symptoms. Now, remember I said I would talk to you about the progressive nature of the illness. As I age, I will naturally produce less dopamine. Once the brain is matured physically, about 24, I can lose anywhere from 7 to 10% of dopamine production naturally. So if I got a lot of dopamine, I'm fine. The normal loss of it is not a big deal. But if I'm below normal, after a couple of decades, I may really have some serious dopamine production issues. Um, Also, as I age, I will have less dopamine receptors available, we naturally lose dopamine receptors through the aging process. It's also kind of why, um, I don't know if you've noticed, but the symptoms that we talked about earlier, they can apply to our geriatric population. They have memory problems, motivation problems, irritability, frustration, not feeling connected. Very, very similar. Because as they age, their dopamine production drops, their dopamine receptor availability drops. And so you get a lot of people, hey, you kids, get off my lawn, right? Type of stuff. And so they might actually get some improvement through the use of L-methylfolate. But the real understanding here is um, if I have the brain disorder of addiction, if I don't produce enough dopamine and have dopamine receptor issues, it's going to worsen as I age. So that's one of the reasons why I always talk about recovery being a long-term uh, uh, proposition. I've got to get, my recovery has to grow, um, and so it's not about grabbing a chunk of recovery and hanging on to it. It's I've got to get better at it. I have to be more honest with it. I have to help others more often. And if I grow in recovery, it can counterbalance the natural decline in dopamine uh, tone loss. So when I feel known, understood, cared about, and I'm when I'm present and in the moment and authentic with others, that I have almost I maximize dopamine receptor availability. I feel known, understood, cared about, and if I keep that amount of receptors available on a regular basis, that's going to improve dopamine tone levels. So like I said, if I have dopamine production issues, I can do something about that. If it's dopamine receptor, I mean the reuptake problem, I can restrict the how much dopamine gets sucked up so that it's more normal. So um, the way that I keep dopamine receptors available, that's what recovery is really for. Um, and if all I'm doing is recovery, then I better hope I don't have too much dysfunction at, at dopamine production point or at the reuptake valve. Uh, so, so genetics definitely the main cause of addiction. Now, you can abuse substances. That's not generally the main cause, but if you're hanging around people that are using powerful substances and you just want to hang around with them, and even if you're not really enjoying it, you're still doing it, yeah, you could damage dopamine receptors over time and cause dopamine, or let's say you have, you know, an injury and you have to be on opioids for a while. If you stay on those long enough, you can do damage to receptors as well. Now, the other cause of addiction is trauma. Um, Whether it's childhood or later, trauma definitely impacts dopamine receptors. Um, and so if you have receptors and you experience trauma, some of them will withdraw and won't necessarily come out. Um, and you notice with people with that have experienced trauma, they have major trust issues. And I can't, if I can't, if I don't feel safe enough to allow people to know me, right? If I don't feel safe enough to reveal who I am and be in the moment, then I'm not going to be able to maximize the amount of receptors available. So, you know, so whether it's military, whether it's childhood, whether it's as a young adult or just an adult, trauma has a huge impact on the dopamine receptor density, and that's one of the reasons why treatment for trauma is so necessary for people with addiction to get past, because you can't recover by yourself. You need others in order to recover. You don't get dopamine receptor increases by yourself. And so if I'm not comfortable with others, that becomes a real struggle. All right. So addiction is not a drug problem? Correct. Drugs, whether a substance or behavior, you know, once we stop talking about substances, we start talking about the brain, we can look at all these different things that affect it. I mean, we had a woman present to us who was 43. Well, no, she was 45, but at 43, she started drinking, and by 45, she was full-blown alcoholic. No history of addictive use prior to that. Very odd. You know, she's drinking like 2 bottles of wine a day, and so it didn't really make sense. People don't just become, you know, just, you know, what happened? Because people don't typically become alcoholic at the ripe old age of 45 after only drinking for basically a year and a half to 2 years. And what we found was we had a question that asked if she'd ever had any bariatric surgery, and she had. And what bariatric surgery is like is like gastric bypass or gastric sleeve surgery. Um, so she'd apparently been obese, so she'd been using food as her main dopamine source for so many years. She finally got okayed for the gastric bypass surgery. She had the surgery at 43, right? Now she's got this, you know, smaller stomach. Um, she really can't eat much, and she never really liked alcohol before, but she had a little wine and smaller, you know, stomach lining, no longer food. She quickly, her brain's like, I need something. Think of the midbrain as an entity that's on a search and consume mission. It's looking for the next thing. You know, you take that away, what's next? What do you got? And for her, it was wine. She took a little bit, like, ooh, this is kind of nice. So before you know it, she's just, you know, guzzling wine, and she can't understand how she developed addiction. She didn't develop addiction; she'd always had it. She just didn't. It didn't present or didn't manifest in a traditional way that that we look at. But if you start to view it, as I said, the brain looking for something to light it up, it makes perfect sense. All right. Now, it's the brain disorder that finds the drug that provides the most reward. So you'll hear people all the time. They'll say things like, "Oh, don't smoke marijuana. It's a gateway drug. It's a gateway drug." It's not a gateway drug. It's usually the first thing people find, and for those that are looking for something to spike dopamine, it works really well. Like, yeah, I'm gonna smoke this after school. Now, that's not why people end up using cocaine. That's not the reason why people start using opioids or meth or whatever. It's, hey, this is pretty good, right? And they smoke that. And then eventually they come across somebody that's got something more powerful and they do that and like, holy crap, this is really good. And so they like, all right, see you, cannabis. I'll keep you around when I need you, when I run out of the other stuff. But it is, oh, this stuff really works well. You know, not everybody's the same. One size does not fit all. I couldn't stand cannabis. I didn't like feeling like I was melting into a chair. There are people that um, take an opioid and they're like, I'm ready to go to bed. And other people, I'm ready to clean my house. It affects them depending on where dysfunction is in that part of the brain. It lights up these different parts. So it is um, important to note that not everybody likes the same substance because not everybody has the same genetics, the same dysfunction in that part of the brain, where it is specifically. Some people use a broad range of things, and others very specific. This is all I do. Um, so drugs don't cause addiction. It's the brain disorder of addiction that causes or finds the drug use. It's just a question of what's the best one. Instead of drug of choice, we call it you know, the substance of that you know, finds provides the most relief, right? All right. So what's the goal of treatment? Well, before we get started here, let me just say, if you're inpatient, the goal of treatment is for you to become an outpatient, right? And if you're outpatient, the goal of you is to transition outside of treatment or out of treatment into a recovery program of your own and if individual therapy as well. But the goal is to prepare you for the next level. And ultimately, the goal is for you to become someone who is in recovery, independently in recovery. Because what we know is this, is if you get into recovery, you will undoubtedly help other people. And those people that you help will help other people, and that's how this works. So, but you can't get there if you've misidentified the problem. It makes it really difficult. So, goal of treatment is to basically stabilize the midbrain, where addiction takes place, by normalizing dopamine tone, right? And if we can normalize or increase dopamine levels to adequate levels, then we don't have these low dopamine symptoms. Now, if we don't have low dopamine symptoms, then we don't have the need to treat them. So we can use medication to improve dopamine production and increase the synapse time. So what's really interesting is, that reuptake valve that I talked about? That's pretty important because cocaine blocks the reuptake valve and allows dopamine to stay out. Really interesting mechanism. So for people that like cocaine, that tends to get you to believe that maybe there's a problem with the reuptake valve, which means that they might be a candidate for Wellbutrin. That's what it means. Now, amphetamines and methamphetamines take that reuptake valve and reverse the flow. So usually it's sucking it up, now it's spitting it out. So once again, if you understand how these mechanisms work, it can give the doctor an idea of what medications might be more effective. Now, if you are able to aid the midbrain if it's needed with dopamine production or reuptake or whatever, you also need to engage in group activities, whether it's inpatient, IOP, outpatient, or 12-step, right? because when I engage in these groups, when I allow myself to be known, when I feel the connection with other people, it improves dopamine receptor availability, or how many receptors are available, otherwise known as density. So if I can do those things, that's why it's important. Why go to meetings? Because I need to find a way, while I'm in this group, whether it's inpatient or outpatient, I get to know all these people. They get to know me. That impacts me. I feel better, right? And I may feel as though I am well, but when I am, I've connected with these people, and I've temporarily increased my dopamine receptor availability, and therefore my dopamine tone. I leave them and I don't come back, I'm going to slowly drift down to my normal level unless I'm engaging it with other people on a genuine, authentic way. So that's really why 12-step recovery is needed. But also, really difficult to go to AA if I've got my low dopamine symptoms that are so severe. So what are they? Try to go to an AA meeting when you can't focus, you can't remember, you're frustrated with yourself, you're irritated with everyone else, and without motivation. I mean, it's like I don't like these people. It bugs me that they're happy, and you can leave and go, that was the worst hour of my life. However, if we have decent dopamine tone or levels, when you go there, you can experience an entirely different meeting. So anyway, the real goal of treatment is to create more recovering people, because we can create more recovering people. We know that those people will be beneficial to other people trying to get in recovery. All right. Don't forget to thank Howard. Dr. Howard Wetzman is an addictionologist and mentor of mine. He was the medical director and then the one of the owners of the Townsend treatment centers. And I will meet with him on a weekly basis, me and all the other counselors, to learn about the neurobiology of addiction. Brilliant man. He's got a book, Questions and Answers on Addiction. He's also got some YouTube videos. Strongly encourage. But anyway, he really opened my eyes as to what addiction is. I knew it was more that it wasn't a substance problem, but I didn't know the specifics. So I'm eternally grateful for him. And hopefully you got something from this. And if you do have any questions, since this is not live, you can always submit them, and somebody can get them to me, and I'll try to do my best to answer them. They can get it to my email or whatever. So yeah, any questions? Hopefully anyone that's there can at least write them down, and I will address them. So look, we're almost at an hour. I know I've enjoyed this. Hopefully you have. I look forward to more of these opportunities to share the information that I've gotten. And if this is helpful in any way, give us some feedback. If it's not, give us some feedback as well. Anyway, you guys have a great rest of your day, and I will see you again soon.